But we will have him do a slow walk to the front of the room while they get his slides set up, which it looks like we were able to do successfully, which is great. So please join me in welcoming Professor Kamin.
Thanks for that.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me and for accommodating some changes in my schedule so that I could be in here first thing this morning. I am not in student services. I'm not a public health person. My background is in constitutional and criminal law. Since about 2009, I've been interested in marijuana law, which in 2009 was barely a thing, and today is a burgeoning field. I teach a class at the University of Denver called Representing the Marijuana Client, and each year, somewhere between 5 and 20 of my students go into the practice of law with an eye toward representing both regulated marijuana businesses and regulators, people like city attorney's offices, the Department of Revenue here in Colorado, which regulates marijuana along with alcohol and other substances. So this is, when I got this invitation, I said, I'm not really a public health, my work is somewhere else, but I think it is really important for people who are in this area, who are working with students, who are advising students, to be aware of the legal landscape, the ever-changing legal landscape surrounding marijuana. So what I want to do, my goal really is to leave as much time as possible for your questions. Because I'm a lawyer, I have to say I can't give legal advice, but I am fully willing to talk about what the legal situation is, the interaction between state and federal law. International considerations for your international students are going to be really important, I think are really an overlooked area. So let me run through what I have to say by way of background, and then I'm really happy to take your questions. So I tell my students the place to start when talking to any client about marijuana in the United States is that marijuana is a Schedule I prohibited drug under the Federal Controlled Substances Act, right? And living in Colorado, you can forget that. It is easy enough to forget that this is still a substance that is prohibited in all instances by federal law. And not just prohibited, but it's listed along with psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin, narcotics like heroin, as a Schedule I drug. By contrast, cocaine is a Schedule II drug. What it means for something to be a Schedule I drug is it has no approved medical use. No federally regulated doctor can prescribe it. You lose your federal prescribing license if you do. And probably most important for most of your students, and the Vice President Simpkins in his introductory talk raised a lot of things I'm going to talk about. It's important to remember there are still significant criminal penalties for people who grow, sell, and even consume or purchase cannabis under federal law. Now, we all know that within a few miles of where we're standing now, there are giant warehouses filled with marijuana being produced. There are emporia where you can go and buy marijuana. All you have to do is show ID like you would to buy alcohol. And so, as I say, it's really easy to forget that this is completely illegal under federal law. And the amounts of marijuana that are being produced in Colorado and now in a number of other states are sufficient to put people in jail for the rest of their lives. Right? And I think any conversation about marijuana and whether students should be working in this industry or whether universities should partner with this industry really have to keep this in mind. Furthermore, attempts, both political and legal, to get Congress to change the status of marijuana have consistently failed. You may be familiar with the Gonzalez against Raich case. The Supreme Court in 2005 essentially said Congress may regulate marijuana. It may regulate marijuana that is grown, in Angel Rachel's case, on her own property for her own medical treatment. Marijuana that never left her farm was nonetheless prohibited, and she could be arrested and charged for it. Congress has the authority to regulate marijuana everywhere, notwithstanding inconsistent state laws. Okay? And while this remains true, this also has been going on. This is change in, these are state marijuana law reforms. It used to be that every state, and I can make these slides available, so I'm happy to share them with you all. The red here is medical laws, the green is adult use laws, and the yellow is CBD only laws. We'll talk about what that means. But what we can see is that back in 1996, when California passed a medical marijuana law, every state also prohibited marijuana. So it was prohibited by federal law and it was prohibited by state law. Today, this number is 50. Every state has legalized marijuana for at least some purpose, whether it's for all adults who want to purchase it the way they do alcohol, whether it's for medical patients who are using it to treat some medical condition, or whether it is just the non-psychoactive CBD. Every state now has legalized marijuana to at least some extent, okay? There's a contrast here, and there's a contradiction between states permitting, regulating, taxing that which the federal government continues to prohibit. Okay? How does this play out? Well, what I describe is, and what we've been living with since, to one extent or another, 1996, is what I call an unstable status quo. That is, there has never been anything in American history that is licensed, regulated, and taxed by the states while being prohibited at the federal level. That's what got me interested in this as someone that does constitutional law, as someone who's interested in federalism, the relationship between state and federal law. We are experiencing an experiment we have not seen before in our history. Okay? And that means there is a lot of unsettled expectations. That means a lot of people don't know what their rights are, what's legal and what's not. And that's going to be really important for all of you as you work with students on your campuses. So, what do we know for sure? Well, we know the federal government can't prohibit state legalization. They can't force the states, they can't commandeer the states, as a lawyer would say, and require them to make marijuana illegal. If a state wants to legalize it, it can. They can't be forced to criminalize it, they can't be forced to help enforce federal law, they can't be forced to recriminalize that which they've chosen to legalize. But the states also can't defend or immunize their citizens from federal prosecution. If the federal government tomorrow wanted to come to Colorado and arrest all the people growing, selling, and consuming marijuana, at least for recreational purposes, for adult use, there is nothing to stop them and there is nothing the state can do to intervene or protect its citizens. Okay? This is why I call this an unstable status quo. We have a multi-billion-dollar industry, as Vice President Simpkins pointed out, that's built on quicksand. Every transaction they engage in, every plant they grow, is a federal felony. So no one is currently going to prison. The federal government has not chosen to come into Colorado and arrest people, to go into California and arrest people, but there are what I call collateral consequences to the fact that marijuana remains prohibited under federal law, and the Vice President alluded to a number of these. I'll just sort of flag some others for you. Risk to federal benefits is a big one, particularly for folks on college campuses, where those campuses are reliant on federal funding, where those students are reliant on federal grants and loans. Those grants can be put at risk through if people are engaged in marijuana conduct. Now, it's not, we don't have a lot of instances of people losing their federal grants, of places losing their federal funding as a result of engaging with or either the marijuana industry or with personal use, but it is a concern that students should be aware of. For international students, this is particularly important. When Canada, to our north, legalized marijuana at the federal level last year, the border folks at our northern border said that they would be asking Canadians as they came into the United States whether they worked in the marijuana industry, and if they did, they might be barred from entering. Because those people are seen by federal law as drug dealers, notwithstanding the fact that we have lots of drug dealers here in the United States, here in Colorado, here in Denver. That would be something that would be taken into account when considering whether to permit people to enter the United States. Furthermore, for people from outside the U.S. who are entering the U.S. as tourists, as students, if they engage in, they may be asked upon their return to the United States whether they have engaged in marijuana conduct while here. There is a story that Joel Warner, my sometimes co-author, wrote for The Westward here in Colorado a few years ago about a couple. She was a Colombian citizen, he was a US citizen. When she would come to visit him, they would occasionally go to a dispensary in California. She took pictures, put them on her social media. Some visitors to the United States have to share their social media with Customs and Border Patrol agents. They saw that she had been to a dispensary. They asked her if she had purchased marijuana. When she said yes, because it's legal here, she was barred entry to the United States and is currently on the permanently barred list. So for people that are coming to and from the United States, for people who are not legal residents of the United States, marijuana use and the marijuana industry are a really important thing for them to be considering. I'm helping to organize the Law and Society meeting that's going to be here in Colorado next year, and we have to put something in our guide for international visitors, what they may and may not do, or what may be risky behavior for them with regard to our industry. Employment, as the Vice President mentioned, there are still a number of employers who will ask about this, particularly federal employers, particularly federal contractors. And this is something that your students definitely need to be aware of. We had a case here in Colorado called Coates Against Dish Network. Mr. Coates is a quadriplegic who uses a wheelchair and was also working for Dish Network in their phone IT support. He is a medical marijuana patient. He uses medical marijuana to control seizures. He tested positive for marijuana, to no one's great surprise. And he was dismissed from Dish Network because they have a zero tolerance policy. He sued for wrongful termination here in Colorado, and the Colorado Supreme Court unanimously decided that he could lawfully be fired for using marijuana, even medical marijuana, even though there was no showing he had ever been impaired. And so for employment, this is still very much a lot of concern. Maybe less relevant for some of your students, but something that concerns a lot of people is parental rights. There have been stories of people who move from non-medical marijuana states to medical marijuana states to purchase CBD oils and other products that they believe will help their children with seizures and other disorders who have their parental rights put at risk when they return home with these products. Okay, so when considering the best interest of the child in custody and other considerations, one of the things that courts may look at, some courts in some states may look at, is whether the parents are engaged in criminal activity and marijuana remains criminal activity. So the point of all of this is that your people are not being arrested, the federal government is not cracking down, but the fact that marijuana remains illegal at the federal level has enormous consequences both for your students and for others. So that's where we are. What do we have in terms of change at the federal level? Where do we think things are going? We have this thing, it seems like it was written by a committee, the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer Amendment. This is a spending rider that's been put into appropriations bills probably for the last 5 years now that prohibits the federal government from enforcing its laws against those in compliance with state medical marijuana laws. Okay? It essentially says money appropriated to the Department of Justice can't be used to prosecute people who are in compliance with state medical marijuana laws. Okay? That means if your students are engaged, are patients, and are using marijuana consistent with state law, they are presently, immunized from arrest and prosecution. That's good news, but not great news. All those collateral consequences I mentioned still apply. All right, just because they can't be arrested doesn't mean they can't lose their job, their federal benefits, doesn't mean they can't be denied entry to the country if they're non-citizens and so forth. Okay? But that is for, particularly for families and people with young children who are in using marijuana, is a protection that's currently in place. Epidiolex, which is a CBD-based drug. CBD, as I mentioned, is the non-psychoactive, one of the non-psychoactive components of marijuana. A pharmaceutical drug using CBD has been moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 5, the least serious schedule, and a lot of people see this as a prelude to the legalization of CBD at the federal level. It is very much not that. If you're just going to say, oh, I just use CBD and CBD is totally legal, it is not, or it may not be. And I think it's really, I have for years seen at national chain stores products that say CBD oil legal in all 50 states. It is not, it was not. That is just, I don't want to know the lawyers involved in that. But CBD, all the products of all the distillates and offshoots of the marijuana plant are illegal at the federal level, with this one exception. Or at least that was true until the 2018 Farm Bill. I'm sure you were all thinking when you got up this morning that you'd be hearing more about the 2018 Farm Bill. It's definitely worth getting up for early on a Friday morning. I don't care about the 2018 Farm Bill either, except that it removes cannabis plants with less than 0.3% THC from the Controlled Substances Act. That is, it essentially legalizes industrial hemp. Okay, and you may hear a lot about industrial hemp. What the 2018 Farm Bill said was that the states will be able to permit the cultivation of industrial hemp, and that industrial hemp and the things derived from it that are regulated by state law are not illegal at the federal level. Okay? That means that CBD produced in compliance with state law is now legal, was not until quite recently, but boy, there's a lot of conflict and uncertainty surrounding the production of industrial hemp. There was a case in Idaho where a truckload full of, I think it was Washington State or it was Oregon-grown hemp was being shipped to Colorado for processing, and got pulled over by Highway Patrol. Highway Patrol said, "You have a truck full of marijuana." I said, no, I have a truck full of industrial hemp. It's less than 0.3% marijuana, or THC, therefore it's perfectly legal. The Highway Patrol officer said, tell it to a judge and arrest. Right, so you're going to have a lot of confusion about, I can't look at this and know that it's less than 0.3% THC. It might be, I think I probably caused a rescue and then maybe arrest. So this is, the industrial hemp can be shipped, can be produced, can be extracted, but there are still lots of concerns there. And the CSA is still a law, which means that the production, sale, etc. of marijuana, with that one exception, is still prohibited federally. So, is there some prospect that's going to change? Right, it is going to change in the near term. There are a couple of bills that are and have been before Congress in the last several years, and principal among these is the States Act, sponsored by Elizabeth Warren and our own Republican Senator Cory Gardner, making it one of the few really bipartisan attempts to fix this unstable status quo that I was talking about. It essentially just lets the states opt out of the Controlled Substances Act. It says, if you, the states, are doing the kinds of thing that, say, Colorado is doing, where you're regulating it, where you're licensing it, you are controlling the extent to which it is leaving the state, you are keeping it out of the hands of kids and out of the hands of drug dealers, people selling other drugs. If you can do that, you can opt out of the Controlled Substances Act and choose to regulate it yourself. Only state law would govern marijuana production, and conduct conforming with state law would be 100% legal. If you've been paying attention to this point, you know that 100% legal is a good thing. It means you don't put your federal benefits at risk, you don't put your ability to travel to and from the United States at risk, and so forth. Okay, so that would be a really significant change. The feds would retain control by saying the following states may opt out. You have to be able to show X and Y and Z before you get our permission to opt out, but if you are able to meet those criteria, you can. The Marijuana Justice Act, sponsored by Cory Booker from the state of New Jersey, removes marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act entirely. It would get the federal government out of the marijuana enforcement business and would allow only state law to govern, which again would make that conduct legal. Conduct complying with state law would be 100% legal. Now, as I said at the outset, I'm not a public policy person, but I have been involved in policy. I was on the governor's task force to implement Amendment 64. I have been testifying in Canada, in other states, about what we did here in Colorado, what worked and what didn't work. And I sort of want to stop with this, this image. This is an image I think a lot about. Let me just sort of walk you through it a little bit. As we talk about what happens next at the federal level, I think it's really important to keep this in mind. So on the bottom axis here, the horizontal axis, we have, moving from left to right, decreasing regulation. Okay? So we have highest degree of regulation is prohibition on the far left. Things like heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine are over there, and currently marijuana. The vertical axis is health and social problems. Right, so there are big problems associated with prohibition. We've seen this since the 1920s, right? Prohibition means lawlessness. Prohibition means no taxes, no regulation, right? If you're prohibiting something, you're not testing it. You're not making sure that it's pure. You're not making sure that it is what's advertised, right? No one is, no federal agency is in charge of maintaining the purity of heroin. It is a prohibited substance. Anyone dealing heroin is a criminal. That leads to an illegal market and gangsterism. By contrast, as we move this way, we get things like alcohol and tobacco. Now again, these are relatively unregulated industries, at least as compared to being fully prohibited. And of course, we know the downside of having relatively unregulated tobacco and alcohol markets. We get products targeted to children. We get industries that make most of their profits off their problem users. And what's really disconcerting to me is this area here of relatively low health and social problems is empty. Right? We have substances at that end and substances at this end, and there are problems associated with both. As we move forward and think about new ways to regulate marijuana, new ways to deal with marijuana, my hope is that we find a way to end up here in the middle. And I think Colorado has done a pretty good job with this, right? As the Vice President said at the outset, you come to Colorado, you move to Colorado, and you're sort of surprised by how unspectacalar Colorado is. I get lots of calls from lots of well, spectacular in lots and lots of ways, but marijuana isn't one. I get calls from lots of foreign press, and they say, hey, we're going to be in town to do a story, we'd love to interview, and we'd love to where can we go and get some B-roll of people smoking marijuana? I don't know, you can't really. So what do you mean, what is the places where people are engaged in marijuana smoking, in public or in, it's like, no, that's illegal, you can't do that in Colorado. Or they say, okay, well, what about some garish billboards or some, it's like, no, you can't really do that either. We have an outdoor advertising ban, you can only have one sign on your store. Right, and if you fly to LAX, on the one road out of LAX, huge billboards, stop at our store, stop at our store, stop at our store. Nothing like that in Colorado. I just got back from Las Vegas. Las Vegas, there are trucks that are going around with big signs on them. Come to our store. We don't have that. So I think Colorado has done a pretty good job of falling into the bottom part of this horseshoe, where we have a regulated market. We have prohibited certain products that we think are too appealing to teens and young adults. We have an outdoor advertising ban. We have good public education. So as we move forward, and I'll stop here and take your questions, I think thinking about this, about minimizing the social harms at both ends of this, is really something that Congress and states should keep in mind. So with that, I'm happy to take your questions. I have no idea how much time we have left.
Yeah, for like 20 minutes or so.
Great, perfect, that's where I'm at. Yeah.
Could you speak more to some of the, like, I don't know, the differences between maybe legalization in Colorado and the regulations that exist and some other states that have legalized?
Sure, the questions about the differences between Colorado and other states that have legalized. I think, so Colorado went first, and Colorado was, our detractors might disagree, I think relatively conservative in terms of what we permitted, okay? So we, at first required that people be legal residents of Colorado if they wanted to be licensed. We only allowed individuals to get licenses. We wouldn't let businesses that had sort of publicly traded businesses couldn't be in the industry. We have, as I said, the outdoor advertising ban. We have a advertising ban for print and other media that requires that a showing, I think 70% of the, or 3/4 of the viewership or readership of that medium be adults and not children. So if you live in Colorado, you don't really hear ads for marijuana businesses on the radio, unless you're driving late at night. We have recently had a ban on certain edible products, ones that are brightly colored or look like other products. So originally, one of the ways that edibles were sold is someone would buy a gummy bear and then drop THC onto it. And it looked identical to a gummy bear because it was just a gummy bear. It was indistinguishable from other gummy bears, and you can imagine the problems with that. That is no longer permissible under Colorado law. We have everyone who touches the plant in any way, whether they're a grower or a seller, has to be background checked by the state of Colorado, has to be an active employee. If you look at the, one of the things I do, I mentioned I'm helping organizing the Law and Society meeting here. I like to take people on tours of a marijuana business and then an alcohol business. Right, so Stranahan's is a whiskey that's made here in the city of Denver. They have bottling parties where you can get on their mailing list, and if they're going to do a bottling, they take volunteers from the public, you go and you get some free labor and you get a bottle of whiskey at the end. Nothing like that happens in the marijuana industry, right? Every person who touches it has to be a badged employee. They can't give out free samples. So in that way, Amendment 64, excuse me, which legalized marijuana here in Colorado, was billed as a measure to regulate marijuana like alcohol. We actually regulate it much more stringently than we do alcohol. As I said, that's not always the case in other states. Other states, as I said, permit outdoor advertising, they permit other products, and then the licensing is different. We have a permissive license, a compulsory licensing system. Anyone that meets the criteria gets a license. The Department of Revenue doesn't decide how many licenses it's going to give out. It doesn't decide how much marijuana can be produced. It essentially lets the market take care of that. And that has upsides and downsides. In places like New Jersey or Illinois, they have a competitive licensing system where they take bids and they award a set number of licenses to produce a set amount. That has pluses and minuses too. I remember one of the first calls I got after both Illinois and New Jersey legalized for medical purposes. Someone called me up and said, "What do you guys do about the corruption problem?" I said, "The corruption problem?" They said, "Yeah, don't all the licenses just go to the governor's cronies?" I was like, wow, Colorado is different than Illinois and New Jersey. But then I realized they have a very different system, right? When there's a limited number of licenses, you have that concern that there's going to be graft, that there's going to be some sort of corruption. We haven't had that. We've been fortunate not to have that here, I think in large part because we have a more open licensing system. Yes, Matt.
Yeah, so in a state where we have so much federal land, national parks, things like this, what would you tell a tourist or even someone in state who has maybe a cabin up in the mountains and has to go to Estes Park, but you have to go through federal land to get to Estes Park. I have marijuana on me. Can park rangers or can state law enforcement or local law enforcement enforce federal laws upon that person?
It's a great question. So one of the big criteria that the federal government has said we're going to be watching is the use of marijuana on federal lands. And the big no-no is production of marijuana on federal lands. This is particularly a problem in California where there are hillsides that are state land or federal land that are the perfect place to be growing marijuana. It's less of a problem here in Colorado, but I think it is also a problem. The short answer is yes, that is an enormous problem. Yes, federal officers may enforce federal law on federal land. That conduct is 100% illegal. People can and are prosecuted for engaging in that. And that is a real risk that people take if they go onto federal lands. The question about state and local law enforcement enforcing federal law is a complicated one. I would say as a general matter, they do not. As a general matter, they're not that concerned with enforcing federal law. And I wouldn't worry about, sort of being in state lands that are adjacent to federal lands, but the federal lands themselves are a real no-no, right?
So like the park rangers could do it though, right? Like if you're in the Rocky Mountain National?
Absolutely.
Because I've seen people smoking marijuana. I run a responsible vendor program and association, so I need to advise these folks. And I'm like, hey, you guys cannot do this here. You'll get a felony or worse. So I was just really curious about that.
I think it's an incredibly important point, and for people who are educating people about Colorado, Nevada, Oklahoma, places that do have lots of federal lands, it is an enormous problem, right? And it's something that people should be told, if you run a dispensary or if you are in Estes Park or in another area that is adjacent to federal lands, if you're not giving your consumers a handout that says here's where you may and may not consume, you're doing them a real disservice and opening them up to, as you point out, not just these collateral consequences, but the significant threat of a federal conviction that can have all sorts of problems.
Thank you.
Great question, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, so for an international student that may have participated in recreational cannabis and when it's time for them to go back to their country, and then let's say they're not permitted to enter and they're a citizen of that country, and let's say when their visa is about to run out here in the States, what happens to that student?
Sure, so I have not seen that. I don't think that's a concern that people will not be allowed back to the places where they are a citizen. I think the real concern is for re-entry to the United States, right? That for people who don't have either permanent residency or citizenship in the United States, there is a real risk associated with cannabis use either at home or here, right? And I think for those students, scare tactics are appropriate, right? This is my first time. I was a little thrown by speaking at a cannabis prevention organization. I didn't quite know what that meant, and I was originally a little concerned about that. For international students, the consequences are significant and should be really clear to them that, if they're adults and they can make their own choices, that's one thing. It really does put their ability to return to the United States, and I think that's going to be the biggest concern, the ability to return to the United States at risk. And that risk may, what the percentages of that risk are, I cannot say. There are also better and worse social media and other practices they can engage in. I had a student who was a law student of mine ask me for a recommendation to future employers, and I took about 10 seconds to look at his social media, and I called him into my office and said, your social media makes you unemployable, right? It's nothing but, unless you're going to work in the industry, but he wanted a job as a lawyer. I said, there's nothing but you getting high at Red Rocks and nothing but you getting high and, and all. This is a terrible choice, right? I'm not telling you not to do those things, right? And I'm not telling you to lie on your applications, but, the thing you are doing is a really bad choice, right? And next time I look at his social media, it looked quite different. Yes?
So I kind of just want to add to that.
Please.
I think part of what we are responsible to do for our students is educate them. And part of that education really does mean if you're in college because you're wanting to better your career, you need to be very careful. You need to understand social media. These are 18-year-olds. They don't have a clue. The other thing with that is depending on what career you're going into. So we have a WinTech program. Our WinTech program, a few years ago, we had a student who was being courted by the biggest WinTech company.
What is WinTech?
WinTech is windmills.
Oh, okay.
Those huge windmills. Until they did a background check and found he had an MIP for alcohol. And they came back and said, we're not hiring you. So, I mean, the insurance and stuff that they have to go through, they're gonna say it's sort of like the aerospace engineering. No, we just won't do this. The other is with international students, we have one, I was just talking to my international coordinator, and she's working with a student who's transferring from another college to us. And she's going, there's flags here, right? What's going on? And we think he may have been arrested, gotten basically an MIP for marijuana. So she checked with their national laws and everything, and they said, it's crapshoot. It's who you're gonna get coming back. They may go, no.
Yeah.
And then you're stuck, you don't get a visa.
Yeah, I think international students, particularly in the current climate, are the ones most at risk and the ones that need to be the most careful. I have been for many years the chair of our admissions committee at the law school at the University of Denver, and I was going to say you would be shocked, but none of you would be shocked. The number of minor in possession, number of public intoxication, and then increasingly the number of minor in possession of marijuana, driving under the influence of marijuana, small amounts of marijuana. The number of students applying to law school with those on their transcript is significant. Right, we see literally dozens of those each season that we're doing admissions. Again, it's not for us, it's not a per se rule. We admit lots of students who have some minor criminal concerns. Other schools might not. The bar might have more concerns than we do, and we tell them to be real upfront with the bar in terms of what their past is. So, you mentioned WinTech. Software, I know there are people, there are a number of companies, and there have been news stories about this here, have sort of given up on random testing because if they randomly test, they can't keep a workforce. And what a lot of companies are moving toward is either a question about recent use, that they may test once at hiring, and someone that can't get clean for one test, they're really worried about. Someone that uses occasionally but can do their work, people are less concerned about. So you see sort of this evolution on the industry side of people accommodating the changes in usage, but that's not something I would rely on if I were those students. In the back, yes?
Considering this group is looking at protecting the health and safety for Colorado or college kids that are in the age range where we've seen increases in youth and young adult use. You want to talk a little bit about the industry innovations in terms of potency, different types of products, methods of intake, and things of that nature, just because I think it's good to give a perspective on that.
Great, sure. So this is one of the most controversial areas. It was one of the most controversial areas in 2014 when I was helping to write some of the regulations. There were arguments that we should ban edible products entirely, that we should ban concentrates entirely. One of the popular consumption methods, I think it's what the question was alluding to, is things like dabs, where people are smoking 90% pure THC. And I think there are a lot of concerns about those products, that they increase acute intoxication and the consequences of that. There's a lot of discussion, though I don't know how much science there is, about the relationship between the use of those products and psychoses. So I think that is a thing that raises a lot of concerns, right? Along with the edible products, right? The edible products, the concerns are for people who are accidentally over indulging. And the sort of classic example, you take a bite, nothing happens, you take another bite, nothing happens, you have a candy bar, which is 5 servings, and then an hour and a half in, you have a very bad experience. I think that all of those are real causes for concern, particularly for people who are moving maybe to Colorado for college and experimenting and experiencing these things for the first time. And I think education plays a huge role in that. I think that you mentioned it was mentioned earlier the vendor training, teaching people who are selling these things to know their consumers, right? To know what that person's experience level is, to give them good information about how to safely consume those products. There's a real controversy about high THC products, and I think the best argument in favor of allowing those products is public safety. When Amendment 64 first passed in Colorado and before the stores opened, we were seeing all these house fires and explosions where people were trying to make concentrated products at home using butane, right? They were using butane in an unventilated area inside their home, and there were a not insignificant number of people burning themselves, of garages or homes or basements exploding when people were using this product. It seemed that there was a consumer demand for this product and that people were going to meet that demand whether it was regulated or not. And we decided that having it regulated made more sense, having it produced safely made more sense, having the contents of it testable and knowable made more sense. But those are dangerous products. And I think that consumer awareness, education is really important in those areas. Did that answer your question?
Yep, thanks.
Great. Yes.
I don't know, we're almost at time, but you mentioned that there's a responsibility to educate consumers, but that's not a legal responsibility, correct? There's not a dram shop law that would exist for cannabis and how we see the serving of alcohol.
It's a great question. The short answer is we don't really know yet.
Sure.
There are going to be lawsuits against marijuana manufacturers and sellers, right? Colorado, I think, does a good job with testing. I think we do a good job with the traceability of products. So this is one of the things, you asked about the contrast between how other states are doing this. One of the things that Colorado innovated was seed to sale tracking, right? There's a barcode on every plant. It travels with that product as the plant grows, as it's harvested, dried, cured, and then if it's infused and goes into a consumer product, it is traceable back to the plant. So if there ends up being mold, or if there ends up being pesticides, perhaps more importantly, we can trace that back, figure out where that happened, and get those products off the market. Does that mean that there will be no liability for people engaged in this? No. I think that if there are people injured by this product, we are going to find out whether things like our laws that make the sellers and producers of these things liable. We don't yet know the answer to that. We're going to figure it out. And the folks I know that do tort and do toxic tort litigation are very curious about this, and we'll be bringing some of these suits in the near future.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, just kind of piggyback off that, because with the dram shop, which says you can't serve a physically intoxicated person, would that still apply to a dispensary who sells marijuana to somebody who's visibly intoxicated? Because you can say visible intoxication is they're high, correct? Or
Yeah.
they're drunk, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, I don't think we know the answer to that. One thing that's really important in this regard is that we don't have sale for consumption on premises in Colorado, right? So there is any licensed premises in Colorado for the production or sale of marijuana prohibits the consumption of marijuana on the premises, right? So if you think about all the ways that alcohol is sold and consumed, we have very few of those available for cannabis. We really only have packaged liquor as an analogy here. So you can't get it in a restaurant, you can't get it in a bar, you can't get it at a sporting event. The places where alcohol is sold and is sold to people who are currently consuming it, and you have sold them previously, we don't have that here in Colorado. Now, you could sell someone, an eighth of an ounce and they come back half an hour later, apparently impaired. That raises some of those concerns. But it's quite different because you, the seller, aren't in their presence at the time they're consuming.
Right, yeah, so I mean, that's just like a very gray area for me as a trainer, because I do alcohol training, I do cannabis trainings. And I just tell all my dispensaries and even my alcohol folks, I'm just like, don't, if you think they're high or drunk, vice versa on the dispensary side, just, you have every legal right not to serve them. Is that correct? Would that be correct to say, like, they can say, I'm sorry, sir, you're visibly intoxicated, I can't sell you marijuana?
I don't know that regulation that well, so I don't want to, speak to that. Certainly makes sense,
Okay.
right? I think that erring on that side, it is unlikely to run someone afoul of the regulator. Erring on the other side certainly might.
Cool, thank you.
Yes.
And I would say that might change with the introduction of House Bill 1234, which will allow hospitality locations where people can purchase and consume on site. So maybe next summer we'll do this again and we'll have more information on what that will look like.
More gray area.
Right, so I mean, this is sort of crucially important, which is until that bill passed in this last legislative session, there was nowhere to publicly consume cannabis, to openly consume cannabis in the state of Colorado, right? And this led to, again, some real public health concerns. So if you can't, there were people, if you're a renter, your landlord can prohibit it from your rental property. You can't consume it in the place you bought it. You can't consume it in a public place like a park. Where are people doing this? They're doing it parked in cars. They're doing it in alleys outside of bars. Again, from a public health perspective, that's not what we want, right? So, the idea of, they called it the hospitality bill, which I think is really great branding by them. The idea that, there should be some place where you can purchase it for consumption, where you can consume in a place not in view of the public, where others aren't impacted by your consumption, I think was a really important change in the law.
I think we have time for one more.
Great, yes, please.
I just have a really quick question regarding the, if you have a medical marijuana license, and does it pop up in background checks? Specifically, I heard that if you try to purchase like a firearm and they do a background check, it could possibly prevent you from.
So I think the answer to those questions are no and yes. I don't think it shows up. I don't think the Colorado registry is cross-referenced elsewhere, but there is a question on the firearms form that asks whether you are I'm going to get the language wrong, a user of illegal drugs. And there is a statement from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms that anyone who uses cannabis, even for medical purposes, is an illegal user of drugs. Therefore, if a firearms vendor knows that you are either a marijuana user or a marijuana patient, they are prohibited by federal law from selling the weapon. Right? Now that's one that relies on either the knowledge of the seller or the truthful answer on that form. And maybe this will be the last thing I'll say, which is, I said when we were talking about what we have to tell international students, one of the absolutely most important things is they cannot rely on federal forms.
Yeah.
Right? If they are relying on federal forms, they are going to end up in real trouble, right? That is definitely grounds for, not just not getting the federal benefit, but that is criminal in every instance, right? So that, as we advise these students, I think one of the things that is paramount is you cannot rely on these forms. Don't put yourself in a position where your re-entry to the country or you're receiving some benefit relies on you not telling the truth. That puts you in an impossible situation. Do we have time for one more
Yeah.
question? Sure.
If you're okay to say, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'm good.
Going off of what he just said,
Yeah.
what are some of those criminal consequences if any of those students that I talked to ask?
The criminal consequences of,
Like lying on a federal form.
yeah, that is a federal offense. It is one that is enforced. The Justice Department under Jeff Sessions said it was going to prioritize people who lie, particularly on federal firearm forms. Even if the underlying conduct is legal or is legal under state law, lying about it on a federal form or to a federal official never is, right? And those are, people aren't often prosecuted for those and rarely do prison or jail time for those, but they can and they do, and that is a easier conviction for a federal prosecutor to obtain than trying to prosecute someone in Colorado for using
I guess in the scope for an international student, is there like a form that like a cannabis use would show up?
I don't think so. I think what it would be is in an interview at a port of entry.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Sorry,
I'm happy to take these questions.
Yeah.
I don't want to slow down.
No.
Let me take these two and then we'll start. Please.
So just to add to that, is there no way for, you're thinking international students that are coming into the country, right? They're like 18, 19, 20, they're pretty young. Is there no way that when they're coming into the country, they're advised of, hey, these are the laws of the state that you're going to, like any way through the visa process that actually lets them know, hey, don't do this?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure there is no one who is explaining what I explained about state and federal law at the port of entry. Right? Now, some of that, this would be a great side gig. If you guys can get me to educate people in South America or in Europe, just to name a couple, to fly there and educate them about coming to the United States and cannabis consumption, I would love to do that education. But I don't know whether that's being done. I know that's not being done at the border, right? I think, whatever their home institution or their home resources may or may not be educating them about. My guess is they're told to strictly obey all laws. Whether they know that marijuana remains illegal under federal law, I would be very surprised.
Well, maybe that's a takeaway for all of you who are here from a legal state from today's effort, is to think about who works with international students at your institution and start to make some inroads, because obviously that is part of recruitment and then coordination of travel to the country.
Yeah, I mean, to me, those are the students who are most at risk here, right? I don't care a lot about people losing their Pell Grants or their federally insured, loans. I have heard about students who are not able to re-enter the country.
I know, right, I heard that in Denver, there was a bill about psilocybin decriminalization. What is that?
Sure, so the city of Denver voted to decriminalize, not to legalize, but decriminalize psilocybin production and consumption and sale. Psilocybin, as I showed the chart, is still a federal Schedule 1 drug. If someone comes in the country and they've got psilocybin pictures all over their social media, a border agent could say, did you use this product when you were in the United States? Did you use this product at home? Do you sell this product? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, the ability of that student to enter the country is significantly impaired. And maybe we'll stop it there. Thank you guys so much. This was
Thank you, Professor Kamin. That was wonderful.
Thanks.
So I didn't explicitly ask any of the presenters if I could share their emails, but they all work at an institution of higher education or for the state. So I thought it was probably available information. So on the back of your agenda, you will see all of the presenters today in their emails. If you have additional follow-up questions, I think you're welcome to reach out to anyone that will be presenting today. I will also say that under your agenda is a copy of our evaluation. We'll be collecting those at the end of the day today. So if you can fill those out and provide feedback on the day.